John 15:13 says, "Greater love has no one than this, that he laid down his life for his friends." And with that, I'd like to go to my first guest here today, or my guest today is Chris Marola. And Chris is a historian of, he can tell us more about the Revolutionary War and most of the wars that were fought in this country, and about how veterans have affected our country from through the course of the years. How about it, Chris?
Well, gee, you give me a lot of credit. I hope I can live up to the expectations.
I think you'll be all right. I think we'll get there. In fact, I tell you what, there's probably no one. Actually, Chris is being very modest. He was actually an historian for Congress. Did I have that right, Chris?
Kind of, sort of. Let me put it in perspective. My wife and I lived in Washington, D.C. for 10 years. And what happened was I went on a tour in the Capitol building. And we've all seen that big circular building known as the Capitol building. Well, inside of it is something known as the Rotunda. The Rotunda is beautiful. The artwork is spectacular. There are pictures on the wall inside that Rotunda that are 200 years old or more. There was a officer of George Washington who painted those pictures. His name was John Trumbull, and he was an officer that served with George Washington. So he painted these pictures inside the Rotunda. Again, this is inside of the Capitol building. But I know what you're referring to about the history and the American Revolution, because this is how I was able to get on Capitol Hill and work for a congressman and write speeches. I wrote speeches for a congressman on Capitol Hill, and this is what happened. I went to a tour, what was this, January, maybe February of 2007, and there was a historian by the name of David Barton. He's a Christian historian. No one has more documentation about our founding fathers and their Judeo-Christian worldview than David Barton. So he was giving a tour of the Capitol building. My wife at the time was working for a congressman. So I went on the tour with her, the congressman, and David Barton. And he was asking questions to the other people on the tour. And as it turned out, no one else knew the questions or the answers to the questions except me. And this happened 3, 4, maybe 5 different times. And I got to, just demonstrate that I knew the history of our American Revolution. And as it turns out, the congressman that my wife worked for noticed this and was so impressed, he actually hired me to be his speechwriter because he was impressed with my knowledge of the American Revolution and the history surrounding the Revolution. So that's what you're referring to.
Yeah, that's and like I said, it's a really good story. It is, and then your father and your mother have a special story you can tell about them also, and about the American. I forget which arm. Well, you'll have to tell me that. I know they lived in Italy, and I know that the American, was it an infantry division that saved the town?
Well, you're right. Yeah, you've got the main talking points down.
You're teaching me well.
Yeah. Well, here's what happened, and it's situations like the one I mentioned. Just simply going on a tour of the Capitol building, because I never had a tour. I wanted to see this tour, and I wanted to hear David Barton speak. He's a great historian, and it was awesome. And there was like a 2 or 3 hour tour of the entire Capitol. It was awesome. Never could I have imagined that he would ask the people on the tour, about a dozen questions or so, and, hardly anyone had any answers, and it just happened that 4 or 5 times that I had the answers. And that is how God used something as simple and innocent as that to get me on Capitol Hill. And it reminds me of the verse in Psalm 37, verse 23, it says, the steps of the righteous are ordered by the Lord. Some translations say directed by the Lord. And then the next verse says, he delights in every detail of their lives. Wow. So God is interested in every detail of the lives of people who believe in him, who trust in him. And he opened that door for me to get on Capitol Hill in a way that I never could have imagined. And going back to what you said about my parents, this is obvious divine intervention. You know, in my mind, there was obvious evidence of divine intervention. So I guess you want me to tell that story of how the
I do. I think it's amazing.
The 3rd Infantry Division liberated my parents' town.
Yeah.
So my parents both grew up in Italy during World War II. And they grew up in a small farming community of about 3,000 people. This is south of the town known as Monte Cassino, where the Battle of Monte Cassino was fought. So the Nazis and the Americans fought a battle on this big, gigantic mountain called Monte Cassino. And so my parents' town was maybe a half hour south of that, in the region known as Caserta. So if that makes any sense. So if you look on a map of Italy, you can kind of grasp it. So 3,000 people, they're just farmers, just hardworking, blue-collar, working-class people, right? And the Nazis took over their town. What happened was, I'll give you a quick background on the story. In the summer of 1943, the Italian people rose up and said to Mussolini, this dictator of Italy, we're done with you. You got us in this war on the side of the Nazis. We're sick of this. We don't want to be aligned with Hitler. We don't want to be in his war. And they killed him. They actually took their country back from a dictator and killed him. And then said to the United States, we want to be on your side of this war, not the Nazi side. We're out. We're done. So they switched from the Axis powers to the Allied powers of the war. And when they did that, all of the German soldiers who were part of the Nazi party and Nazi army run by Hitler, they were those Germans who were in Italy, those German soldiers who were in Italy were now stuck. Overnight, they went from being allies to Italy to being enemies of Italy. Just like that, overnight. And it's no fault of their own. Again, I like to remind people, not every person who was of German descent who served in the German army was a Nazi, but they were being ruled by the Nazis. So what happens is, just like that, they're the enemies overnight of Italy. They're the enemies of the USA. So these soldiers had to start making their way from Italy up through that little boot. You know, you've seen the picture of Italy, the shape of it, it's a boot. They had to make their way through Italy, going north, and go through Switzerland and get back to Germany. So they literally had to walk, or maybe if they were fortunate enough, maybe a tank or a vehicle. They had to move their way through Italy, going back to Germany, because now they're stuck behind enemy lines. And as they're doing this, they come through my parents' town. So this would have been October of 1943. And they take over my parents' town. They said, get out. We're going to take over your farms. We need food. We need a place to live, place to shower, bathe, whatever. And they were hauled up in this town for a whole month. And what happened was my parents and their families, they had to run, and they took whatever food they could with them, and they went into the mountains and lived there for an entire month, watching their town not only taken over by the Nazis, but they watched their town be destroyed because the British were bombing the town in order to take the Nazis out. So as the British are bombing their town to take out the Nazis, they're destroying their town. And so it was just a devastating thing, and they're living inside these caves for a whole month. And so after about 3 weeks, what ends up happening is they ran out of food. And they only got by for about a week on nothing but goat's milk and cow's milk. It's a good thing that these farmers took their cows and their goats with them into these caves. And, they made sure their goats and their cows grazed. And so next thing you know, they're making milk, and they got by for a whole week on nothing but milk, no food. And here's where the divine intervention comes in, John. They were praying. They were God-fearing people, and they were praying for a miracle, okay? And there's a scripture in Jeremiah that says, where God said to Israel, "You will find me when you seek me with all your heart." Obviously, you're on the brink of death at that point in this cave, okay? You don't know how much longer you can hold out just drinking milk with no food, okay? And you're depressed, and you're heartbroken. You're seeing your town devastated. Who knows how long they could have held out? And so they're praying, they're seeking God for an answer. And they're hoping that the Americans will arrive in time, and they're praying that will happen. And sure enough, after they started praying, the 3rd Infantry Division, the U.S. Army 3rd Infantry Division, rolls into town, drives the Nazis out, and gathers up all their food and rations and feeds that town and saves the lives of everyone in that town, including my mother and father, who were 5 and 7 years old. Pretty incredible, isn't it?
Yeah, and there's your father wrote a book about the whole deal, the whole thing. Would you like to let us know or give us the title of that and where we might be able to find it?
Yeah, great. Thank you for asking. What happened was I'd been talking with my father. You got to write this down. You hear all these stories for years. You've got to put it on paper. I can help convert it to a book. Just write it down. I was telling him, Dad, just write it down. I will turn it into a book for you, okay? I have experience. I wrote speeches for a congressman. I wrote press releases for him, too. I've written op-eds for him as well. After I left Capitol Hill, I wrote 25 columns for townhall.com, which is a conservative magazine, online magazine. So I have some experience writing. I said, just put it down on paper. I'll fix it for you. So he did, finally. This would have been October, November 2014. He put it all on paper. And my wife went through it and transcribed the entire document that he had written. He wrote it all by hand, okay? He wrote the whole story for the whole book by hand, and she put it in a Word document. And then I went in and wow, had to revise and tweak some things and turn it into a book, add chapters, and give them names, give the name a book, or give the book a name, and create, a glossary and all this stuff. So after about 70 hours of excruciating work, I took the body of the book that he gave me and I converted it into a book. And then we started selling it in our hometown in Newcastle, PA. And he sold a couple hundred books just taking out an ad in the Newcastle News. But then the bookstore went out of business because people buy everything online today. So that was the end of it. So for a couple of years, we didn't sell anything. And I'm going to say for about 3 or 4 years, maybe 3. Yeah, from about 2016 to about 2019, we weren't selling the book. And my nephew, he's into nutrition and works out, and he sells books about nutrition on Amazon. And I said, if I gave you the electronic file for my dad's book, could you put it on Amazon? Could we sell it there? He said, sure. So I gave it to him. He loaded it into, the correct files, and it's now on sale on Amazon.com. And what a fitting time to be talking about the U.S. Army liberating my parents' town. Tomorrow's Veterans Day, right?
Yes.
And so if you go to Amazon.com, in the search bar, you just have to type Tragedy and Triumph by Dominic Marola. You don't even need to even say his last name. Dominic is enough to bring up the book. Tragedy and triumph, Dominic, is all you need to say. Those 3 or 4 words, tragedy and triumph, Dominic, and you'll bring up the book and you could purchase it. The hardcover, I think, is $15.99. And if you want to buy the electronic book that you can get on a Kindle, I think it's like only $8. It's relatively inexpensive. It's only about 200 pages long, but it encapsulates his experience growing up in Italy during World War II, my mother's as well, and then how they had to travel across the ocean, come here, immigrate, and start all over with nothing but the clothes on their back and a few bucks in their pocket. And there's no doubt in my mind that God answered their prayers. And through divine intervention, he allowed, here's that ordering of your steps again. Here's that directing of your steps. That I truly believe in my heart, I have a conviction about this, that the Lord directed the steps of the U.S. Army, the 3rd Infantry Division, to show up in their town at that time. If they had showed up a week later or 2 weeks later, those people probably died. And if my parents die, then I don't exist. So I truly believe that the timing of the U.S. Army showing up to liberate my parents as children in Italy is directly related to their prayers.
Hey, Chris, with that, we're going to have to take a break because my engineer here, Bill's he's driving the train, and he says it's time to pay the bill. And we're back with Chris Marola, and Chris is going to, I'd like to speak a little bit more about Veterans Day and things like that, because tomorrow is Veterans Day, the 11th hour, or the 11th day, the 11th month, the 11th hour. And as my grandmother always called it, she called it Armistice Day until forever. She had brothers that served in World War II, and that's just the way she did. So anyways, I want to, is there anything we can, let's go to some of that today, right now, Chris, if we can.
Yeah, no problem. Let me just start with this. There was a time, I'm going to say 2009, maybe 2010, after I worked on Capitol Hill, directly across the street from Capitol Hill was the office where I was working for a political communications company. I was writing political campaign ads for conservatives running for office. And this charter bus pulled up right next to the building where I was working. There was a restaurant there, and they were going into the restaurant. And I saw them wearing World War II baseball caps. And I asked them, are you guys World War II veterans? They said, yeah. And I shook their hand, and I told them the story about my parents, and they loved it. And so I actually got on the bus with, 50, maybe 55 of these guys who were all World War II veterans who were touring. They drove into Washington, D.C. to see the World War II memorial. And before they could see the World War II memorial, they went to eat lunch at this restaurant right next door to where I was working. And I just happened to come outside the door when they were there and talk with them. And it was awesome, and they loved the story. And it made me feel so proud to know that these guys had served in World War II, and they were military veterans. They loved the story. It was just so awesome. It was a great experience. And the cool thing about this, every so often I'll run into somebody who said, my father served in World War II. Or someone like my uncle served in World War II. And it just makes me so happy to know that my life would not be here if the United States Army did not liberate my parents' town and many other towns from Nazism and fascism. And so we forget, and it's unfortunate, we need to remind people the heritage that we have in this country. World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, the Vietnam veterans never get their fair shake, and they deserve to. You know that the U.S. military won every major battle in Vietnam, and we won the war, but we weren't allowed to win we weren't allowed to win the public relations war. but our military won the combat war. So it's just a sad commentary on the politicians that would not allow our military to take credit for having won all those battles. And it all goes back, all of this goes back to the American Revolution. If you think about what was really going down at that time, these people, Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Patrick Henry, who you quoted before the beginning of the show, they were, how can I say this? They were the descendants of the British Empire and the British aristocracy. They were wealthy. They were the leaders of their community. They had no reason to uprise and overcome the British monarchy. Yes, they were being oppressed by King George. He was rotten to them. He was treating them very badly. But they could have said, you know what? I've got my money. I've got my plantation. I've got my farm. I'm wealthy. I'm happy. Too bad for the rest of those poor people who can't afford to make a living. I'm just going to chill. I'm going to enjoy my life. I'm not going to rock the boat. I'm a member of the British aristocracy, you know, the upper class. Why should I rock the boat? And yet they went against the British Empire and that British upper crust aristocracy and the monarchy, which were kind of wed together. It's one thing to recognize they went against the British Empire, but they also undermined, this is brilliant that they came up with this, they realized the problem wasn't being British, the problem was the system of government that the British were employing. A monarchy is a centralized form of government, meaning very few people have all the power, much like in socialism or Marxism or communism. All the power is concentrated in the hands of only a few people. And they realized this was wrong. So from a political perspective, the monarchy was wrong. They also understood that the aristocracy was also wrong because only the wealthy and the elite in the British colony had the power. If you're middle class, lower middle class, you're poor, too bad. They also recognized that that was wrong too. And so they decided to turn everything upside down, to undermine and remove the political institution known as the monarchy with its centralized government and get rid of the aristocracy. They created a system of government and a culture that said you would be rewarded not based on how much money you have or whose son and daughter you are. You are rewarded based on how hard you work. In other words, it's a fair level playing field, okay? If we take the aristocracy out of the equation, even a poor guy, even a middle-class guy can achieve something, regardless if he was born into poverty or not. You couldn't do that in the British Empire. If you're born into poverty, you're stuck. If you're born a blue-collar working-class guy, too bad. Only the wealthy had the power. That's why there was a House of Lords in the British Parliament. The Lords, the people who had the control of the government, the House of Lords, were the aristocracy. And they said, no, this is wrong. We're going to create a whole new system of government. So our founding fathers basically said, we're in for the long haul. Whatever it takes to unshackle the chains of this oppression by the British Empire, okay, which is a centralized government, all this power in the hands of a few people, and let's get rid of this aristocracy idea that only those born into wealth can be the leaders. They said, we need to open this up so anyone can run for office, regardless if they're rich, poor, or in between, and bring to the table their ideas and make this country great. And that's what they fought for. And when they signed the Declaration of Independence, I'm not sure if I can get the exact quote, but I'm going to paraphrase. They said, we pledge our lives and our sacred honor to do this. It was amazing. And you mentioned, John, that there are a significant portion of these signers of the Declaration of Independence who were either persecuted or left penniless. Did you mention that before?
Yeah, I can. I'll read that right now. By signing the Declaration of Independence, the 56 Americans pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. It was no idle pledge. 9 signers died of wounds during the Revolutionary War. 5 were captured and imprisoned. Many of their wives, children were killed, jailed, mistreated, or left penniless. 12 signers' houses were burned to the ground. 17 lost everything they owned. Yet, no signer defected. Their honor, like their nation, remained intact. And that's, I mean, there was 56 men that was willing to give everything they had. Just like a lot of, tomorrow's Veterans Day, and I'm gonna let everybody know that one more time. On the 11th hour, we need to bow our heads and thank God for all the men that served this country, so that we could do the things we want. Now we just went through an election here, and wherever you stand on that is which side of the deal you're going to stand on. That is one thing or the other. But if it wasn't for these men that decided that was willing to lay down their life so this country could stand, we wouldn't have had an election yesterday on last Tuesday. I mean, like you say, in the Revolutionary War, if we would have lost, guess what? All 56 of them would have been hung, and they wouldn't have waited to take them to to England or London to hang them. They would have got hung right here. So, like I said, they were willing to give everything. And so, just like the soldiers in World War I and World War II and Korea and Vietnam. Actually, I have a friend now. His name is Joe Zoller. Joe flew 200 combat missions in Vietnam. Now, you can say what you want, and Joe, he'll tell you also that he went to fly a plane when he went over there, and he was a young man. But but to fly 200 missions, that's unreal. That you're bad to the bone when you can do them kind of things, and you weren't afraid. And it's just like you said and brought out. That's a very good fact. We didn't lose a battle in Vietnam.
Mm-hmm. No way.
It was a political thing that took us clear out. So I mean, they decided that. I mean, and the president well, let's put it this way. I ain't going to call him president. Joe Biden was one of the people that did everything he could to keep from getting our allies out of Vietnam when they were taking them off the roof. And everybody has seen the scene. Gerald Ford was put in a terrible position when this all happened, and they managed to get, I believe, 1,500 people of our allies out before they finally lost. I guess that would be Saigon, wouldn't it be, Chris?
Yeah, it was the fall of Saigon. Yeah, you're right. Gerald Ford was actually a decent man who got a raw deal because he came into power because of Watergate, and that really, he also pardoned Nixon, and he took a pretty big hit because of that. But he was a decent guy who tried to bring some kind of resolution to the fact that there was no end to the war. Here's a piece of history, again, that we don't always hear about. Many people like to talk about a guy named Walter Cronkite. They say he was such a good guy, fair guy, good newscaster. You know what we're starting to find out about Walter Cronkite? He wasn't as fair and wonderful as everyone thinks. Here's what happened. There was a battle called the Tet Offensive, and it was massive. It was bloody, and we lost. The United States lost a whole lot of lives, like thousands and thousands of lives at this Tet Offensive.
That was in 1969, I believe.
Yeah, I believe it was that era. Yeah, circa 69. And what Walter Cronkite and the major media in America did was report how many casualties there were. And it was horrible, and it was terrible. And reporting that turned the American public against the Vietnam War and against our veterans. But here's what they never told us. They never told us this. They never told the American public as bloody as it was, we won the battle. They never said a thing about the USA winning that battle, nor did they say, as bloody and deadly as the Tet Offensive was, 10 times more Vietnamese or the Vietnamese military died. In other words, yeah, there was a whole lot, thousands of Americans died, but 10 times more of the Viet Cong and the Vietnamese army died. What does that tell you? It means our military won the battle. Yes, it was bloody, it was gory, it was horrific, but we won. And that was never mentioned by Walter Cronkite or anyone else in the media. They just talked about the numbers of Americans that died, and they made it seem like this was impossible for us to, and they started, from that point on, is when the people started turning against the war in large numbers. There was always people against the war, but it started turning the whole country against the war because we lost the Tet Offensive, supposedly. We never lost the Tet Offensive. U.S. Army and the U.S. military won the Tet Offensive. Yes, it was bloody, but unfortunately, that wasn't told. And so the media has a way of manipulating people into believing things that aren't even true. And one of those was the battle in Vietnam, the Tet Offensive, that, yes, it was bloody, but our troops fought valiantly and won, and that was never discussed in the media. Isn't that something?
That is something. And hey, with that, Chris, we're going to have to take another break, and on the other side, we'll continue this for a little bit. And we're back with Chris, and we're talking about our main subject today is veterans and how they've helped build this country and how they sacrificed to build this country and for all the freedoms we have. We got about 5 or 6 minutes here, Chris. Would you be able to, you want to kind of close up with some short story or something that you might have?
Yeah. There would be no America and no American Revolution and no American Revolution that succeeded without a lot of people. But one person stands out. He's the linchpin of the revolution and the linchpin of the founding of America, and that's George Washington. And yes, we know we named our capital after him, but people don't know what an incredible man George Washington really was. For instance, George Washington was the richest man in Virginia. He had more money than any man in the whole entire state of Virginia. He gave every dime, we're talking millions and millions of dollars, every dime of it to the cause of the revolution. Incredible. He gave all of his millions, which probably by today's standards, that could be probably $500 million or maybe even $1 billion. I don't know what the numbers would be, but they would be massive. We're talking at least hundreds of millions of dollars. He gave every dime to the cause of revolution. What sacrifice! What an amazing man, And at one point in the revolution, our troops weren't getting paid. Congress couldn't pay them because they were spending so much money on the revolution. Congress could not pay the troops. I think they went like a year or two without any pay. And they had finally won the war, okay? And they still weren't getting paid. And so the military was getting ready to have a coup and take over the country. And Washington was appalled. They had just fought, for all these years, okay, to get this country, all right, to defeat the world's greatest army and navy. And they finally had this system of government ready to go. And the military, U.S. military, was going to take over the country because they were angry they didn't have any money for several years, and Congress couldn't pay them. And George Washington gave a speech that moved the military to tears, and they called off the coup. George Washington, in my opinion, was the greatest, and I think many historians will agree, the greatest of all the founding fathers. Absolutely stellar. In fact, Thomas Jefferson said of George Washington, he said that George Washington was completely incorruptible. In other words, You could not corrupt this man. Wow. So this is the sacrifice. And these are the people that made this country what it is. We can't let it go. There's so much at risk. And I know there's issues that have happened in our nation, slavery and segregation, bad things, absolutely. But no country in the history of the world has done more to rectify and fix the wrongs of the past than the United States. The United States is no worse when it comes to the bad things we've done, no worse than any other country or any other civilization. But what makes the United States great is that no country has done more to fix and rectify the wrongs of the past. The system of government our founding fathers gave us works. There are checks and balances there to keep one person in one group from having too much power and to allow this country to fix its wrongs. We would not have that if it wasn't for the founding fathers and their sacrifice.
Well, Chris, I'm going to have to close up right now. I really want to thank you for being here. I know you're going to be, me and you got some plans for later on and down the road. We're going to try to make some things happen. It's been a great show. It has. And I really appreciate everything you've said. And thank you very much for being on here today. You humble me greatly by calling in and being on my show. Thank you.
Well, I'm humbled that you'd have me on. Thank you.
And with that, we're going to close today.